All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Joey Politano, editor of the newsletter Apricitas Economics. Welcome to Free the Economy, Joey.
Happy to be here.
All right, so now you write about economics for a living, and when I was thinking about how to describe what you do and your attitude towards it, I was reading your about page, and it includes a statement: "The beauty of economics is in its humanity. Every day, every single person on this planet contributes to and participates in the systems and processes that economists study." End quote. I like that a lot. So tell us, how does that idea guide what you do, what you write about, how you write about it?
It's very funny because I think I wrote that about page now probably 2 years ago, and I don't think I've looked at it since I wrote it for the first time. Um, but no, I think when I started studying econ, I think there's this like outsider perspective that it's like very hoity-toity kind of business nonsense that makes up the bulk of what econ people are studying. Um, and when you look at like the actual research going on, that's not true at all. And then the thing that you realize going through um, enough of what economists are studying is like, oh, this part connects to my life. This part connects to the things that I've experienced, or this makes something that I didn't understand before make more sense. And those are all great important feelings. And when in a more joking way, I usually say like people, whether they want to or not, are participants in the global economy. So it really makes a lot of sense to um, be very interested in that. And it's also if you're the kind of person who thinks, okay, how do I do uh, the most good in the world? How do I affect change in a really important way? Well, here's this system, the set of systems that people have to interact with on a day-to-day basis. Getting that right is so important to getting everything else right.
Well, yeah, and I think one of the things that people kind of don't understand about kind of economic thinking and why they think it's sort of a weird thing that's for other people and not something for them to think about, is that it's the idea that it's all about numbers and math and money and very large amounts of money. And so if you're not a person who has or manages very large amounts of money, that doesn't have anything to do with you, right? But I think in there are plenty of sort of valuable books about economics that have sort of pointed this out, like in Ludwig von Mises's book, Human Action. The title, I think, tells you a lot, um, that economics is the study of how humans interact, how sort of society works as a society. It's sort of, so it's a little bit like, related to social psychology. It's a little bit related to sociology. Um, but it's not just about a tiny handful of rich people with lots of money moving that money around in ways that don't affect the rest of us, right? All of our decisions, consumption decisions, to go to college, not to go to college, to go to this college, not to go to that college, to buy a new car, to buy a used car. Like these are all kind of examples of economic thinking. And like you said, the if you want to understand how to like have an impact on the outcomes in the world, then tools like economic reasoning are like a good construct to help you guide your enthusiasms, however grand or modest they might be. And you know, the I was just talking in the last interview we did here about with a fellow podcast host, Corbin Barthold, who does the host the Tech Policy podcast, and I asked him about what his approach to his podcast is, and he's like, "Oh gosh, I gotta think back about what our what my basic ideals are, because unlike you, I don't read my mission statement at the beginning of every single episode." And but I think I had the so even though I do repeat it, I think I have the same experience that you just mentioned, which is thinking about back to when I first wrote it, which now has been a couple years ago, and thinking how my, overall attitude towards the world hasn't changed, but the experience of sitting down and thinking through it is definitely something that happened, was sort of a thing of that moment, right? And it's easy to see all the like kind of changes that have swirled around us since that time. And another hobby horse of mine is I think that understanding economics, especially policy, economic policy, government policy, often has as much to do with perception as it does with numbers. And over the last year or so, we've seen inflation come down significantly from 2022 highs. And, we've had pretty positive macroeconomic indicators in general. The balance between, inflation below 4%, economic growth, modest unemployment. That's a pretty good mix, right? If you sort of look back at the last, whatever, 30, 50, 70, however many years, those three main variables are in a pretty good green zone, I think, for a lot of people. But if you look at opinion polling, you see a lot of people, especially a lot of younger Americans, have really negative perceptions about the U.S. economy. Um, uh, and so we've now had this, what people have been talking about for probably some months now, the vibecession. Right? And so instead of, it's not a recession in economic terms, but the vibes are off and people just feel gross about where the economy is trending. So it's a vibe based recession. What do you think about that? Is the disconnect between economic performance and the vibes as big as some people are saying they are? And if they are big, why?
Yeah, it's very funny because I feel like this discourse is now like um old enough that you've had like theories come and go
We've already
as
had
this
meta commentary on the vibe
we've
session.
already had meta commentary on the commentary that's going around. Um, I do think, the very if you want to take the very simple perspective and say, here, look, like GDP growth is up, unemployment's very low, wage growth is very high. That should mean that most people's perception about the economy in a time like that would be good. Or you take the very advanced approach, and I've seen 100 people create these kind of models where you incorporate all these variables and use it to forecast consumer sentiment, and then there's like a gap that opens up over the last few years where sentiment is a lot worse than you expected. So I think that's like a real thing. I think the part that people forget is it's a little bit of a phenomenon outside of the US. You look at polling on the economy in like the United Kingdom or Germany or Japan, it's pretty bad. It's, generally pretty bad. And what makes the US unique then is not the perception that the economy is bad. It's like the economy is actually doing okay. Um, so that's, I think, part of it is like you have this grand international narrative where the US is actually maybe a bit of an aberration. And so we're catching some like bad vibes from other places. But my theory throughout this, which has been uh, um, maybe, I would say a little bit counteracted, maybe a little bit undermined by like recent events, is just that it was like a nonlinear response to the inflation shock. If you look at a lot of research on like how people perceive a rise in prices, they consumers have like a very supply driven model of the world. They think if the price of something is going up, the most likely reason why is that something in the production of it has gone horribly wrong. And that's actually a good like heuristic if you're looking at like gas prices. Gas prices usually only spike when something bad is happening in the oil and gas industry or like global geopolitics. It's kind of a bad heuristic if you're looking at like rent or like food or restaurant prices, where it's like the dominant input is demand and wages. So if you are going to a restaurant, you're saying, well, I remember 2 years ago this was blah 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 cheaper. It's so much more expensive. Something must be going horribly wrong in the restaurant industry. To most people, they're not going to conceptualize that as the economy must be doing so well that people are like eating out a ton. And so I think a lot of it is just people seeing the rise in prices, which is historic and has all the negative consequences of its own, and then also like backfilling these other bad things must be happening because of the signal uh, that I see from rising prices. One of the like most interesting ones that I think about this, like so the University of Michigan survey, which most people are using when they talk about consumer sentiment, they ask a lot of like side questions. And one of the side questions was like, do you think have you heard good or bad news about unemployment in the economy? And even when the US was adding like hundreds of thousands of jobs a month and the unemployment rate was like below 4% and closing on the lowest level since like the 1960s, majority of people said that they'd heard bad news about employment. And to me, I think that's like indicative of both. There's a bit of a media bubble, but it's also that people see the inflation and then they go and seek out, okay, this is going wrong. There must be something else that's going wrong to cause this. Let me go like look at the jobs numbers and you see like this company laid somebody off and you're like, oh, this explains it.
Oh, so sort of primed to receive more negative news.
Exactly, exactly.
Well, one of these questions, it is sort of a meta question that comes up sometimes in surveys like this is, are things bad for you, or do you think things are bad for other people? That surveys don't always split that out or intentionally try and get at both sides of that. But I think it's something that is, especially when it comes to economic news and economic prospects, is something that is an underappreciated distinction, right? Where you can have a lot of people who are, measured lots of different ways, having pretty decent household financial economic uh, situation, but they sort of perceive that there's this big group of people out there that's doing really poorly, right? They don't have a lot of like numbers necessarily because they don't, the average person doesn't get into that deeply, but there's this sort of vague someone else is being taken advantage of, someone else isn't doing as well. Because I think back to my old friend Tim Carney, who wrote a book called Alienated America, that in part was one of these many books that was like, why did Trump happen, right? And one of the things he said is the one of the best predictors, well, the single best predictor of people voting for Trump is people who said they were Christians but didn't go to church. But what the one of the like second or third strongest ones was people who were worried about the economic future of the country and thought a lot of people were doing badly, but weren't themselves doing badly. So there were a lot of pretty well off middle class Americans in various places who thought that there was this like white working underclass of Americans who weren't getting a fair shake anymore, even though they didn't actually have that much to complain about economically, personally. And that's not, Tim's book is not like the first time I've ever heard that, but I think it's one of those things that I've seen sort of pop up, and I also wonder, even if it doesn't pop up, how much that is true, where people say, I'm I'm voting for this candidate or I'll never vote for that candidate, not because I personally feel like I'm left behind by society, but because I think some of my fellow Americans are. This sort of economic anxiety by sympathy. So I don't know if you've
Yeah.
ever looked at that.
I will say this is one of the more reliable findings where you ask people like their personal finances, you know, an overwhelming majority of them will say that they're doing like okay or good. You ask people about like their local town, the number goes down. You ask them about the state, the number goes down further. You ask them about the nation, the number goes down even further. And so to me, it's like, okay, very clear here. It's not just that people think I'm doing okay, the rest of the country is doing poorly. It's that they like the more you abstract away, from people's personal experiences almost linearly, the less good they think the economy is doing. Um, and so I think that there is partially this like m- misperception. Um, like you said, you have a lot of people who are overestimating like the share of Americans who are in poverty or um,
Or who earn minimum wage.
right, right, or the share who are like making minimum wage or any number of like your very obvious, the share who are unemployed, things like that. But I think it's also in a way an uh, explanation of where the problem is coming from, right? And the like personal understandability of the problem. If you're a normal person, you definitely understand your personal finances very well. You definitely understand your town's like economy to a decent degree. To your states, you might understand to a very moderate degree. The national economy like becomes kind of an enigma, and like a global economy even more so. And so if you're saying like I if you're saying I think my local economy is doing okay, I think the national economy is doing badly. I partly read that as saying the things I understand versus the things I don't fully understand. But I also think of it as like, where do I think the problems are coming from? Where do I think the solutions are coming from? And if you view like, okay, the problems are coming from Washington, the problems are coming from like the global economic system. It's not necessarily that such and such state governor is responsible for this. And so I think it is partly a attribution issue. And that also plays into like partisanship. I think there's like the big vibe discussion that people don't have is like you look at like very clearly over the last few election cycles, like when whoever wins, people who identify with that party, their like economic sentiment shoots up, and whoever loses, their economic sentiment shoots down. And like from the most defensible angle possible, that makes some sense. You voted for a candidate because you like their economic policies, and then they win, and you're like, well, they're going to enact the economic policies that I think are good. But I think it's very clearly goes a lot beyond that, where people are asked about the economy and they interpret it as a question about like, you're asked about the national economy. People interpret it as a question of, do you like the president?
Mhm.
And not even like in an abstract sense, do you like the president's economic policies, but literally just like, do you like the president? And so when they respond very poorly to these questions about like the state of the nation's economy, I think in a lot of ways it's a reflection of like what they view the political landscape is. And then they're answering more positively to their state's economy. It's partly because the state just doesn't have that like, most people aren't that mad at their governor relative to the president. But it's also personally that more likely you're gonna actually uh, have a governor that you more agree with more so than the president.
Right. And I've definitely seen those graphs where when even though they're supposedly based on the idea of economic confidence, and do you think the economy is currently in a good shape or a bad shape, when whether it's when Trump was elected or Biden was elected, all of a sudden that party, their approval of the economy shoots up by like 30 points overnight, which from one month to the next, which seems unlikely. Like you said, maybe some of that is forecasting, thinking like, oh well, things will be better in the future if my guy's in the White House, but um, unli motivated more by partisanship than any actual assessment of uh, current economic stats. One last thing about this that I think is interesting that I think plenty of people have brought up, which is uh, you know, why do ordinary people say the have negative verdicts on the economy when most of the economic stats, generally the macroeconomic stats, look fairly good. It's because uh, households and ordinary Americans respond more to the like direct to consumer parts of the economy, right? So they're more susceptible to say increasing food prices are a really big problem. And when I see, you know, they don't spend a lot of time thinking about what's the definition of chain CPI. They think about like how much bacon and eggs and milk costs. And when they see that relatively stable price from the past few years spike up, that is what they care about because that is something that has to do with their everyday life. Whereas economists will say, oh, well, actually, the better way to measure economy is to exclude food entirely, right? Because that's too volatile. So we want a better long term uh, measure. So we're not going to include food at all. And I think in a normal person, a normal middle class person, or you know lower class working class person will look at that and say, well, that's lunacy. Well, that's crazy. How could you say, well, the economy is good, well, excluding the thing that has the most impact on me and my family every week? Um, so part of this disconnect to me seems like maybe that individual households and individual like survey respondents are just much more sensitive to changes in consumer goods. Whereas if you're an economist, you're like, oh well, the change in consumer goods is only one small part of whether we think the economy is healthy or not, and that's why we have this like divergence.
Yeah, and I will also add like all of the research on perceptions of inflation, perceptions of like price increases. It's very clear that the two biggest drivers are energy prices, specifically gasoline, and food prices. And that's where, especially through like 2022, early 2023, you had the absolute largest increases in inflation. And even though those aren't like the dominant share of most households' budget, they're the like most frequent purchases by a country mile. And so if you're saying, "Oh, I'm noticing the price of food going up dramatically," you it's a very easy thing to be able to say, "Well, this is clearly a negative signal, and it's a very big negative hit on my life, and I'm going to perceive this every single time I go into the grocery store. I have to think about this again, and it's very annoying." Um, and so that is definitely true. I will also say, um, like we talk about the University of Michigan's consumer sentiment survey because I think that's what most people anchor to. But it's not just a question that's asking like, "What's your consumer sentiment?" They ask like these more specific questions that they index together onto consumer sentiment. And one of the questions they ask is like, "Is now a good time to make big household purchases like a car, a fridge, you know, things like that?" And that question is one of five. That question had some of the like most negative responses ever in like 2021, 2022, and improving continually in 2023 and this year. Um, but I look at that and I'm like, that's not a totally irrational response. It is like the worst time in decades if you're trying to buy a car. Um, and that's like, how much should that actually weigh on people's consumer sentiment? People don't, buy cars that frequently. Most Americans drive a car uh, um, for several years before they need to replace it. But that's what the question asks, and so prompted about that, I think people give a reasonable response. But then you're asking, say, okay, why is there this disconnect between inflation and unemployment and like what people are responding to in the surveys? It's like it's partly because the surveys are asking about a specific part of the economy that's been hit, genuinely a lot harder than the economy as a whole. Um,
Well, yeah, and I think, I mean, the sort of like the durable goods purchases, like large household appliances, um, kind of speaks to, do you have between $300 and $1,000 to spend on something? Um, Sort of like that's kind of what that quote question is asking. With the car question is different because those things are more likely to be financed. So the conditions I think are more likely to be influenced by interest rates, right? Because if you you know, much like the housing debate, why is there housing lockup? Why isn't there more fluidity? Why isn't there more inventory on the market? All that is tied back to the significant increase in interest rates in the past few years. Um, and so the appliance question, a car question, and a used car certainly are interesting because they could be in sort of an overlapping world of money, right? A very expensive appliance and a very cheap used car are sort of like overlapping there. Um, but if you but in a way, it's sort of two questions because one, you would probably pay upfront, or you would finance via like a credit account, like a credit card account. Whereas the other one, you would get a car loan, and then that would be a more obvious thing you would be aware of. You would also look for like uh, what is my interest rate going to be on this car, um, and that's one of the because the other thing we talked about the household purchases that you see all the time, and therefore they have a bigger impact on how you're perceiving whether the economy is doing well or not. Um, the reason why food and energy and like gasoline are so important, even though they're not like the majority of a household's expenses usually, is that the other biggest cost, housing, is usually fixed over time, at least on a short to medium time. You have a mortgage, or most people have like a 12-month lease if they're an apartment holder, so that doesn't go up every month, or it doesn't go up 5% every month, right? Even if it jumps up at the end of a term. Um, Most Americans have fixed rate mortgages. Uh, so even more than just like your initial assumption, I feel like the the food and gas prices are even sort of asymmetrically more weighted in people's perceptions just because the other big chunk of their household spending is probably fixed over like the medium to long term.
Yeah, I agree there, and I think also, we talked a little bit about, interest rates. I think that's, like, a big player. If you look at, this doesn't factor in directly to consumer sentiment, but if you look at the, like, sentiment questions about, home purchases, they're all, like, very, very bad, like, the worst ever. I think that might be a slight overreaction considering, like, the 2008 recession is also is in that historical record, but people very clearly, like, view this as, like, a massive direct hit to affordability, and I did, um I've seen arguments from like Larry Summers and other people talking about like, okay, actually a big part of this that you're not capturing is this really rapid increase in interest rates, hitting sentiment. We really haven't had that since the 70s, and people are perhaps over anchoring to the 70s consumer sentiment hit as an inflation issue more than an interest rate issue. I will say I was convinced that that was like a partial contributor, you know? I'm not convinced it's, like, the dominant reason or a dominant reason, but I think it is, like, another example of, like, that's a price, in a sense, that economists don't think of as, actually a price in the inflation basket. So if you're looking at inflation, it does not actually measure the cost of mortgages or, um, interest rates except very, very indirectly. And so if you're a normal person looking at the cost of buying a new home that's gone up a ton because prices went up and then it goes up a ton more because interest rates go up, uh, that's obviously going to have a higher sentiment hit than if you're just looking at, well, the price of renting a home went up, XY% over the last 5 years.
All right, this has been a great overview of the sort of vibe session, but we're gonna do a vibe check and we're gonna turn things around. We're gonna get optimistic now. Uh, and one of the themes, we like to talk about here on the show is abundance and how, especially how public policy reforms can create a world of more abundant resources and raise living standards. So, like we just said, housing is a big, one of those big parts of the abundance agenda. And you wrote something really interesting recently about what we can learn from our friends down in New Zealand. What what have we been seeing down the other down under, not Australia, our other down under New Zealand friends? What have they been doing with housing uh, in a place that had seen a lot of constraints and a lot of high prices?
Yeah, I think most Americans are understandably not that familiar with like the Kiwi housing market, but the really important thing to know is that it's like brutal. It's very bad, even by the standards of bad American housing, uh, and it's particularly very bad in Auckland, which is their like largest city um, on the North Island. And so they've had a series of over the last like 2 decades, policies aimed at like alleviating this housing crisis. And I think the interesting thing for policymakers in the US is like we don't actually have that many examples of tectonic change in local policy, in an American context, most of the reforms that you get passed to increase more housing are very marginal in the grand scheme of things. I'm thinking of like California as an example where it's like, okay, you'll have these policies that like um, allows for more accessory dwelling units and thus like increases the rate of housing by a significant but small percentage, where you'll have reforms that allow for like denser housing around transit, and it does it, has some increase. There's not that many transit stops, so it's not like this grand citywide reform. um, Auckland in 2016, the housing crisis got so bad that they did the grand citywide reform. They upzoned, which means you're reducing like the restriction on the amount of housing you can build and the types of housing you can build. uh, for large swaths of the city, something like 3/4 of residential land in the city got upzoned. And they also included a ton of reforms to things like parking minimums or setbacks, which is like the distance from the curb that a building has to be. And all of these like very boring things that actually have like a very big impact on the amount of housing that you can build. Um, and it's like, surprise, surprise, over the last 10 years or so since the upzoning in 2016, Auckland's seen like a gradual and really rapid rise, hitting the fastest rate of construction in its history. And the type of buildings that they're constructing weren't these kind of like suburban single family homes, but like these big like townhomes or terraced homes as they call them in New Zealand, these like big um adjoined developments that were like infill projects in closer suburbs and not like these greenfield projects like way out in the middle of nowhere. Um and it has, like, successfully increased housing affordability, like, put a cap on the rate of price increases. It's led to, like, the, uh it's so big as a reform that it's led to, like, housing construction as a share of GDP and employment, like, really rising in comparison to the US where it's been, like, falling since 2008. Um, and so I think it's, like, the important example of here's a city that was doing everything wrong for so long and actually got together and like made the reform and is seeing like great results because of it.
Oh, nice. Because it's funny when I look at some of these international comparisons about, housing and housing costs. Uh, the graphs say that all the Anglophone countries are the worst. Like the UK, Canada, they're like the the restricted supply, um, and you have the lowest rates of like new home construction and things like that. So of course, rising prices and rents. And that various other countries are doing a little bit better. I mean, Japan's doing better, but it also has constricting population. It's a falling population. But uh, so it's great to see that there is one of those Anglophone countries, one of those English-speaking countries that seems to be doing a great job. So maybe we have that special brotherhood among the English-speaking countries. We even share our military intelligence with each other. UK, US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. So maybe a member of our little brother, New Zealand, can teach some of the bigger English-speaking countries some lessons about actually permitting housing. So, but speaking of housing and economic growth, among other things, I want to quickly pivot to another area that you've written about recently, with some fascinating analysis. Um, we've got California, a golden state, but also a problem child when it comes to municipal governance. So California has got a bunch of issues. It's got housing issues, but as you said, they sort of recently had state legislature had some reforms to sort of loosen things up, but they're also having just sort of economic growth and job problems and sort of population problems as well. They've had outbound migration, but now they're even losing tech jobs. California, the home to Silicon Valley, the place where everyone thinks of as the big tech hub of the world, much less just the United States. Uh, why are the tech jobs leaving California?
Yeah, I will say so. To backtrack a half second, um, obviously throughout like the 2010s, you had this massive tech boom that was super concentrated in California, and the state was always like you said, capital of the American tech industry for decades. But it's really remarkable how much more concentrated things got in California and in the Bay Area specifically in the decade leading up to the pandemic. And the pandemic is like the obvious inflection point. If you look at any of the graphs, it's like straight line up until like late 2019, and then usually stall or like line down in 2020. Um, and I think the very obvious answer is remote work, but it's specifically remote work and the California's combination of really high home prices and very, very little housing construction. You know, Seattle. is on this list of like very expensive American cities, relatively speaking, big tech hub, they did not lose jobs in the same way California did. And in fact, they're like picking up jobs that are moving from California. So it's like highlighting like how extreme the problem is that even a city like Seattle, which is not exactly the cheapest place on planet Earth, is um, is able to gain where California is losing. And you had like a period in 2021, 2022, where the tech industry was just doing so well that it was like rising tide lift all boats very quickly. So California was still gaining a lot of tech jobs. But since then, like the nationwide tech industry is stagnated and California is like losing jobs. And so the number that I think was the biggest highlight here is like, okay, since January 2020, you look at all of the like tech industry employment sectors, California's added like 6,000 jobs. The rest of the United States has added like 570,000. Um, and that's like a serious problem for California as a state. I mean, it'd be a serious problem no matter what. But it's especially serious because California's state government is very dependent on like the IPO boom and pay that goes towards very high end tech workers to fund like state programs, and they've had like a very large budget deficit over the last couple of years because the IPO window closed and because so many like tech jobs were moving to other states. The very, very top end tech work is still very much concentrated in California. You look at like if you look at it as a share of jobs, like I said, straight line down post pandemic. If you look at it as a share of compensation, a share of like nationwide pay, it's a stagnation more than it's a drop. Um,
Because there's
but
still
that's
the like the $1 million a year programmers are still there,
right,
but
right. But
there's
that's
just
like
not a million of them.
right. And I think that that speaks to like if you think about California's fundamental problem, it has really rapid GDP growth like, as a state. Very rapid wage growth, very rapid employment growth, especially in the 2010s. The problem was at some point you hit a cap where the increasing growth of the state is like not able to reach everyone. They don't include everyone because of the housing crisis being so brutal. And that's now it extended up the chain from like, okay, you have, low income and then like middle class households in Los Angeles who like move to Phoenix because they want to buy a home. And now that's like moved all the way up to chain to where you're like, okay, if you're a low level software engineer, maybe it's time to move out of San Francisco because you can get a better place um, for cheaper in Seattle or Austin or what have you.
Yeah, I mean, if you can work as a contractor from Clark County, Nevada, uh, especially if you got your own LLC, um, you're in a potentially good situation. So, um, one more contrast here. We're seeing California. California in some ways is sui generis. It's its own thing. It's such an unusual outlier. Uh, in terms of its size and its economy that there's a question about whether is this a bellwether for a certain kind of governance, or is it is California just California? But we do see better job growth in inbound migration and some other metrics from states, other big states like Florida and Texas, as well as sort of nearby rivals to California like Arizona and Nevada. Um, as well as in general, the biggest, I think you mentioned this as well, the biggest region of the country is actually the southeast, where we're seeing job growth, economic growth. Uh, Now, a lot of people I know, including people who've been on this podcast, who are conservative libertarian supply side people, they're like, oh, because those are red states. Red states are better. Republicans run economies better, especially state regulation, taxes, things like that. That's why everyone should, if you want economic growth, just vote for Republicans, and that's the solution to everything. Uh, uh, Is that the solution to everything? Is that what's the this if we look at two sets of states like New York, Illinois, and California, and they're all big states that are not doing super hot right now, and they're blue states. And then we look at Texas and Florida, North Carolina, Arizona, whatever, they seem to be doing better, and they're mostly red states. What solutions do we learn from that other than vote for Republicans?
I think it's very funny because I think people ascribe this into like a partisan difference. Obviously, like obviously there's a lot of within state differences that sometimes matter more than like across state differences. It's also like the people who are moving from San Francisco to Texas, they're going to like Austin, they're going to Dallas. They're most likely going from like one Democratic controlled subset of California to a democratically controlled subset of Texas. Um, and so when I think about this, and especially when I'm talking to like other Democrats about this as an issue, I'm like, I do genuinely believe the number one driver of this kind of internal US migration is housing stuff, is especially like housing affordability. You look at all of the surveys on why people thinking about leaving a state like California, why people do leave a state like California, why people are moving where they're moving, and housing affordability usually ranks at or near the top on all of these. And it's also like the kind of people, especially pre-pandemic, that were leaving California or New York, um, were not like the kind of people who made several $1 million a year and were like chilling, decided they wanted like a lower tax rate to move to Florida. In practice, it was people who could not afford the kind of living that they wanted in New York and decided it would be easier to obtain in, suburban Atlanta or Raleigh or, what have you. Um, and I think if you're the kind of person who, as a Democrat, you think it's not the housing issue, um, you got a bigger problem that you got to sort out because it would mean that like people are moving for this kind of more Republican mode of state governance.
Well,
And I just think that yeah, well, I just think that like if you're saying this is the core problem for Democrats isn't actually like what the state's tax rates are. It's like what are the state's housing policies. That's like a completely different way to look at it. And the gap, I think this is like underappreciated too. Like the gap is insane between a state like Texas or Florida and New York on like housing production. We're talking cumulatively hundreds of thousands of units just since like the start of the pandemic. And if you look at like Phoenix, which is not like we love Phoenix. Phoenix is not that big a city, um, Phoenix builds more apartments, not just suburban single family homes, but more apartments than the Los Angeles metro area now, which is just like should be kind of insane wake up call if you're in California. I tweet this one every time the like permits in Austin, Texas, and in
mm,
San Francisco come out. Um, and now these numbers are like etched in my brain because of how bad they are. But since the start of 2023, so like 15 months now, San Francisco's permitted like 1,100 housing units. Just the city, 1,000 units total. That's like two apartment buildings. And in January of 2024, so just that 1 month, Austin permitted like 1,200. And so I think people who are like looking at that and don't think it's like the dominant driver, why are people moving from San Francisco to Austin? I'm like, there's your problem. um, yeah, I do really think it's like housing first and foremost. I don't think most people are like looking, optimizing their tax rates when they're thinking about moving, or they're like, I actually really, have this deep-seated philosophical belief about the nature of economic governance. They're making these like kitchen table calculations and going, it would be cheaper if we lived in, Atlanta or Orlando or what have you than
well,
where we're currently
yeah, I mean, obviously people aren't uh complete tax minimizers because everyone would be moving to South Dakota, right?
living.
But those other things certainly do play some role, right? Um, uh, you know, I think, that the housing housing costs are because they sort of everything, so many things are downstream of whether you can afford to live there or not, right? You don't you don't get a chance to do a lot of those secondary and tertiary civic society things if it's too expensive for you to move there in the first place. Uh, so that for the big previously successful states and cities and areas that are experiencing problems now, I think that's probably is the number one reason. Though I definitely am still affiliated with my supply side friends who think that difference in state tax rates and state tax regimes are also significant. I mean, there's a reason why uh, Nevada has the state tax structure it does. One, because it can, because it has gambling revenue, but also because it uses it to attract businesses, which and households, which it has in the past few years. Um, so before we finish, we can't talk about economic trends without talking about China. So we've got China's, the People's Republic of China, the bad China, in my opinion, as opposed to our good friends, the free China, Taiwan, uh, are economic antagonists in China. Um, have a lot to do with how we think about the global economy, certainly from the U.S. perspective. But there's two kind of big things, right? There's two big commodities that have been most sort of controversial in the past recent few years, and that's microchips and cars, electric vehicles. Um, Connected to the electric vehicle system stuff, people worry about solar panels being too cheap and stuff like that, but those are kind of the two big ones. So we've got a big piece of legislation not too long ago aimed at the microchip part, the Chips and Science Act, that has to, among other things, do with giving American companies a bunch of money if they build microchip factories in the United States rather than elsewhere. How's that working out?
So I will say the CHIPS Act is moving at a reasonable pace. So we have shovels hitting the ground. If you look at like the construction in the United States, you see like a really big spike that is driven by these very high end semiconductor fabs. Like the manufacturing construction in the US is at a record high. These fabs, even though they are not uh, they don't employ that many people. They are absolutely massive capital projects that take, tens to hundreds of billions of dollars. So they make up a large chunk of like the manufacturing investment in the US now. You're starting to see like this year, you're going to start to see the first of them kind of come online. The projects that were like started in response to or in anticipation of the CHIPS Act. Um, and hopefully things more or less are hit the ground running in 2025. I will say the like broader regime, you have to think of this as from the perspective of the US, our goal is like, okay, we don't have that big of an electronics industry anymore. This was a big driver of employment and growth, and especially productivity growth in the early 2000s. We need to like claw that back so we can get the productivity growth, and also so that we have like, people are talking about the semiconductor shortages of 2021, 2022. We could have more avoided that if we were in a position like South Korea, where the semiconductor companies are much more attached to the local car supply chain. If you're thinking about this, like from China's perspective, it's a complete inverse. The semiconductors are their biggest import, bigger than oil and energy, and they're extremely dependent on the countries that they dislike the most for that import. They're dependent on Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan to a lesser extent for those imports. And so from their perspective, it's not we need to reclaim this lost industry. It's like, oh my goodness, we need to close off this foreign dependency. Um, and so they have been over the last year also extremely active in supporting semiconductor investment, and in particular in like buying up the kind of semi-advanced equipment that's used for semiconductor production. So if you look at like chip machinery, most of that stuff comes from either Japan or the Netherlands, and they've been buying record amounts of it in anticipation that the sanctions regime that the US has been put them under is going to just keep intensifying, and that they're going to have to like reverse engineer um, more of the advanced chip processes if they want to keep up. Um, I think that one it's a little early to tell. I think China is like achieving a lot of its goals around indigenization of semiconductor manufacturing. I think it's important to also note that they're not quite keeping up in the same way at the very high end, but they're doing really well at like the foundational chips, like the very basic stuff that is universally applied in like appliances. It's almost an insult to call them basic. Um, and they are having some success in like reverse engineering the very high tech stuff that was previously only available in a few places. I think the EV discussion is like a whole different ball game, um, and that one kind of has to start with the Chinese consumer doing really poorly. You know, China is actually not producing that many more vehicles than they did pre-pandemic. They're
But you
just exporting a
but
lot
you have
more of
kind of a
them.
saturated domestic market right now, right?
Right. Well, a saturated domestic market in the sense that, um,
Because you've had declining demand domestically.
right. But I mean, in the sense particularly that, Chinese consumers did not get the bulk of the pandemic era support in the way that like American consumers were the bulk beneficiaries of uh, government support during the pandemic. In China, it was more so directed at producers, especially after the real estate issues in 21 and 22. Um, and so the part of talking about this, people talk about like the EV exports because that's like the view of like the technological frontier. That's where America and the European Union like envision themselves competing and yada yada. But actually, the dominant source of vehicle exports in China are still internal combustion vehicles, and a lot of them are going to like Russia and India and Southeast Asia, um, and that's partly just a literal consequence of like Chinese consumers being squeezed enough that even though they're buying more EVs, they're buying fewer cars in general, and now you have all of this um, production um, that doesn't have an easy home within China and ends up getting exported.
Right. And from the American side, so the Biden administration just announced these sort of like tariffs on Chinese EVs, uh, almost more prospective because the China's not really selling EVs in the United States yet.
Mhm.
Um, but so this is a big question, and this is when it gets back to less economics per se than it is about politics, which is if you are a climate activist, you probably presumably would not want tariffs on Chinese EVs because you want as many cheap EVs replacing as many internal combustion vehicles as possible, no matter where they're made. But if you are the United Auto Workers, or you are Joe Biden's Michigan state chairman, you probably want those tariffs as high as possible. So this this is one of those cases where there's no there's no clear answer on like is as far as I'm concerned, is this a good idea or not? The question is, what are you trying to accomplish? And if you've got a broad political coalition that's trying to accomplish two opposing things at the same time, then it gets pretty complicated policy wise.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree, and I think I've been frustrated by the response in the discourse that kind of imagines a world in which politics doesn't exist. You know, and not to say that you shouldn't criticize like political decisions, but like the Inflation Reduction Act was, in my mind, this like grand climate bargain, saying like, okay, the United States is never going to be able to pass this kind of just let's just do a carbon tax and call it a day kind of climate intervention because it would be so hideously unpopular, and because you need to win over Joe Manchin and the senators from Michigan and all of these like marginal groups that are maybe not they're not like super pro climate transition, but they can be convinced, if they see enough side benefits to justify this. And so, like the EV um, rules in like the Inflation Reduction Act are like obviously very big trade restrictions. In particular, I'm upset at this like back and forth where we say we want to compete with China, we want to like stop the Chinese industry and yada yada yada, and then we turn around and we have like tariff rules that affect primarily the South Koreans and the Europeans. You know that like do we want to compete with China, or are we like using that as a cover for a more protectionist trade regime that actually hits, countries that are supposedly our allies more so. But in like a broad sense, I'm like, yeah, the China, we should let more Chinese EVs into America is going to pull at like -75 in Michigan. I'm not surprised that people are doing it. I think that grand bargain for the Inflation Reduction Act was successful, obviously, in just from the fact that this was the only piece of climate legislation at a national level that's ever gotten passed. Um, I think this is like now we're in the implementation phase, and the bigger question is like, can you keep this uh, grand coalition together of people, like you said, who are uh, um, primarily concerned with preventing carbon emissions, and people who are primarily concerned with like good union manufacturing jobs in Michigan, and are otherwise skeptical of these like climate change claims. um, it's tough, and I think that's like going to be a big theme. Obviously we have the election coming up, so that's going to change. Like, regardless of who wins, there's going to be a different political dynamic that's going to change how people approach the implementation of the IRA. A bit of the unraveling of the coalition that brought that piece of legislation to pass um, is like a serious risk.
Well, certainly between now and election day, there's going to be a lot of complicated economic news to digest, and as we just talked about, uh, how that is going to filter down to political priorities will also be complicated. And really, the place you need all listeners and viewers, the place you need to go to make sense of all that is Joey's newsletter. So, Joey, tell everyone where they can find you all and all your stuff online.
Yeah, I write the newsletter is Apricitas. That's Apricitas. And the website is apricitas.io. If you want to read more, most of what I do is like this kind of economics data journalism. That's how I focus it. It's very hard to get across on a podcast, but I think the greatest strength is like the visualizations
It's a lot of great
in
charts
the
and graphs.
newsletter. Yeah, everybody loves a great chart and graph. Um, I'm also primarily on Twitter. It's at Joseph Politano, or if you just search Joey Politano, it'll come up. I'm also on like LinkedIn if you want to find me there. Um, but yeah,
All right, excellent. We'll be friends on LinkedIn. Thanks for joining us, Joey.
thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.